Judge visits his court as janitor, stops cold when he hears two lawyers behind. The fluorescent lights of the Westlake County Courthouse flickered slightly, casting elongated shadows across the empty marble corridors. It was 7:43 p.m., well past the time when judges, attorneys, and desperate defendants filled these halls with their urgent whispers and purposeful strides. Now only the distant hum of a floor buffer echoed through the building. Judge Nathan Holloway adjusted his worn baseball cap lower over his eyes and gripped the wooden handle of his push broom. The gray custodial uniform hung loosely on his tall, lean frame, a far cry from the tailored black robes that had defined his professional identity for the past 15 years. The name tag pinned to his chest read simply, Nate. No one would recognize the distinguished, silver-haired jurist in this humble disguise. 3 weeks ago, this plan had seemed almost comical. Now, as he swept debris into a dustpan for the 5th consecutive evening, Nathan questioned his own judgment. Judge Holloway would have a field day with this case, he muttered to himself. Respected judicial figure suffering midlife crisis, takes menial job to find meaning. Sentence, mandatory psychiatric evaluation. A wry smile crossed his face as he leaned against his broom. The truth was both simpler and more complex than a crisis of identity. His decision stemmed from a conversation with his mentor, retired Judge Eleanor Winters, during their monthly lunch. The system changes when you're watching, Nathan, she had told him, stirring her tea thoughtfully. Everyone performs differently under the gaze of authority. If you really want to know what's happening in your courthouse, you need to become invisible. Her words had awakened something in him, a growing unease about decisions that seemed to change when appealed, witnesses whose testimonies shifted, and attorneys whose courtroom demeanors transformed completely once they thought he wasn't looking. After 15 years on the bench, Nathan Holloway had earned a reputation for uncompromising integrity. But what good was that reputation if justice evaporated the moment he turned his back? Nathan's musings were interrupted by the metallic jingle of keys. Marvin, the head custodian who had reluctantly agreed to this arrangement after Nathan explained his concerns, and made a generous donation to Marvin's grandchildren's college fund, rounded the corner. "How's it going, Your Honor?" Marvin whispered, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I've told you, while I'm in this uniform, it's just Nate," Nathan reminded him, grimacing at the honorific. Marvin shook his head. "Can't get used to seeing you like this. Seems disrespectful." "What's disrespectful is a justice system that changes when no one's looking," Nathan replied. "Did anyone question you about the new hire?" "Nope. Nobody notices janitors. We're like furniture that moves." Marvin chuckled at his own joke. "You find anything interesting yet?" Nathan shook his head. 3 clerks complaining about their caseloads, 2 security guards discussing fantasy football, and 1 very enthusiastic debate about proper coffee etiquette in the break room. Not exactly the corruption I was looking for. "Well," Marvin consulted his clipboard, "you've got the 3rd floor tonight. Judge Crawford's courtroom and the attorney's break room. Maybe you'll have better luck there." Nathan nodded, gathering his supplies. Judge Crawford handled most of the corporate litigation cases, high stakes, high profile, and high potential for impropriety. "Remember," Marvin called as Nathan headed for the stairwell, "you're supposed to be dusting the vents in the break room at 8:30. The partners from Rains and Carter usually work late on Thursdays." Rains and Carter. The name sent an involuntary shiver down Nathan's spine. Philip Rains and Melissa Carter, 2 of the most successful corporate attorneys in the state. They represented Caliber Enterprises in a major fraud case scheduled for Nathan's courtroom next week. He'd crossed paths with them often enough to develop a healthy professional wariness. They operated so close to ethical boundaries that they practically had 1 foot over the line at all times. "Perfect," Nathan murmured, checking his watch. 20 minutes to position himself. The attorney's break room on the 3rd floor was more luxurious than its name suggested. Leather couches, a gourmet coffee station, and a wall of windows overlooking the city created an atmosphere more suited to a high-end law firm than a public courthouse. Nathan understood the pragmatic reasons, Negotiations often happened in these informal spaces, but the opulence always struck him as slightly inappropriate. He methodically worked through his cleaning routine, emptying trash cans and wiping down surfaces with practiced efficiency. No one spared him a second glance. Marvin was right. The custodial uniform rendered him effectively invisible. At precisely 8:25, Nathan positioned himself on a small stepladder beneath an air vent, feather duster in hand. He had just begun systematically removing dust from the slats when the door swung open. Philip Raines entered first, his tall frame wrapped in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nathan's monthly salary. His trademark red tie was loosened slightly, the only concession to the late hour. Behind him, Melissa Carter carried a sleek leather portfolio, her sharp features accentuated by the severe bun that pulled her dark hair away from her face. Neither acknowledged Nathan's presence as they settled into the far corner of the room. Their voices dropped to a murmur as Melissa spread several documents across the coffee table. "Are you sure this place is secure?" she asked, casting a brief glance in Nathan's direction. Philip followed her gaze, studying Nathan for a second before dismissing him with a wave. "It's just the cleaning staff. They might as well be furniture." Nathan suppressed a smile at the echo of Marvin's earlier sentiment. He continued dusting, tilting his head slightly to better hear their conversation. "The Caliber case is straightforward enough," Philip was saying. "The SEC documentation is circumstantial at best, and the witness testimonies are contradictory. But Judge Holloway is a wild card. He's not easily swayed by the usual methods." Nathan felt a small surge of pride at this assessment, followed immediately by curiosity. "The usual methods? That's why we need leverage," Melissa replied, her manicured finger tapping on a folder marked confidential. "And after months of searching, I believe we've found it." Nathan's duster slowed imperceptibly as he strained to hear. "The Morelli case from 7 years ago," Philip said, his voice dropping even lower. Nathan's blood ran cold. James Morelli? A name he hadn't thought about in years, yet one that still evoked a deep sense of professional regret. "Judge Holloway's one significant mistake," Melissa continued. "A clerical error that ruined a man's life and was covered up by the system." Nathan's hands began to tremble. He gripped the feather duster tighter to steady himself, his mind racing. There had been an error in the Morelli case, a misfiled precedent that led to an incorrect ruling, but it had been discovered and corrected on appeal. Morelli had been compensated. Justice had ultimately been served. Hadn't it? "I've compiled everything," Melissa said, sliding a document toward Philip. "The original ruling, the financial impact statements, and Morelli's personal testimony about how he lost his business, his home, and nearly his family because of Holloway's mistake." "And the media contact list?" Philip asked. "Ready to go," Melissa confirmed. "One call, and Judge Holloway's sterling reputation becomes headline news. Respected judge's error destroys innocent man's life." Nathan's heart pounded so loudly in his ears that he feared they might hear it. This was blackmail. They were planning to use his past mistake to coerce a favorable ruling in the Caliber case. "When do we approach him?" Philip asked, gathering the documents back into the folder. "Monday morning before the hearing," Melissa said. "We request a private meeting, present the evidence, and make it clear that his cooperation in the Caliber matter ensures our discretion." "And if he refuses?" Melissa's smile was cold and calculating. "Then by Monday afternoon, every news outlet in the state will be running the story of how the great Judge Nathan Holloway destroyed James Morelli's life through incompetence, then helped bury the evidence." Nathan's stepladder wobbled slightly as he shifted his weight. Both attorneys glanced in his direction momentarily. "Careful there," Philip said dismissively. "We wouldn't want a workplace accident in our break room." "Sorry, sir," Nathan mumbled, lowering his voice and hunching his shoulders. "Almost done here." They returned to their conversation, now discussing technical aspects of the Caliber case. Nathan forced himself to breathe normally, to continue his methodical dusting while his mind raced through implications. He needed to see those documents. He needed to understand exactly what they had on him, and what they didn't know. As the attorney stood to leave, Nathan accidentally knocked his cleaning rag to the floor. He bent to retrieve it, using the moment to glimpse the file name on Melissa's portfolio. Holloway Insurance. The door closed behind them, leaving Nathan alone with the weight of what he'd discovered. He lowered himself slowly onto one of the leather couches, the feather duster still clutched in his hand. Insurance, he whispered to the empty room. They're treating my worst mistake as insurance. He stared at his reflection in the darkened windows, not the respected Judge Holloway that defendants feared and colleagues admired, but Nate the janitor, a man with a mop and a secret. The disguise that had started as an experiment in judicial oversight had suddenly become his greatest asset. Because Nathan Holloway now knew something that Rains and Carter didn't, he was already investigating them, and they had just handed him the perfect bait for a trap. But first, he needed to revisit the Morelli case and confront his own past failings, to understand exactly what he was being blackmailed with. He stood, gathering his cleaning supplies with renewed purpose. The game had changed, but Nathan had spent 15 years seeing through the performances of those who entered his courtroom. Now, it was his turn to put on the performance of his career. Nathan barely slept that night. The conversation he'd overheard played on endless loop in his mind, each repetition stoking his anxiety and indignation. By dawn, he sat at his kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee forgotten between his palms, staring at a legal pad covered with frantic notes. The Morelli case. 7 years ago. A property dispute that had seemed straightforward until it wasn't. He reached for his secure personal laptop, the one not connected to the courthouse network, and pulled up his private case archives. Every judge kept records of their significant rulings, both for reference and reflection. Nathan's were meticulously organized, a digital testament to his commitment to justice. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard before typing. Morelli vs. Westlake County, 2018 CV 4721. The file opened, revealing hundreds of pages of documentation. Nathan scrolled quickly, skimming past the initial filings until he found his original ruling. 63 pages of careful legal reasoning that had ultimately been wrong. There it is, he murmured, finding the critical paragraph on page 37. He had cited Brennan versus Metropolitan Housing Authority as precedent, a case that had been overturned 6 months prior to his ruling, a fact that had been missed because the update had been misfiled in the court's reference system. Based on that flawed precedent, he had ruled against James Morelli's claim to his commercial property. The county had been allowed to proceed with its redevelopment plan, forcing Morelli to sell at a fraction of the property's value. Morelli's business, a family restaurant that had operated for 3 generations, had closed its doors within months. Nathan rubbed his temples, the memories flooding back. The error had been discovered during a routine audit nearly 8 months later. By then, Morelli's property had been demolished, his business liquidated, and his reputation in the community damaged by rumors of financial impropriety. The appeal had been expedited, Nathan remembered. The ruling overturned. Damages awarded. Justice delayed but eventually served. Or had it been? The question gnawed at him as he showered and dressed. Not in his judicial robes today, it was Friday, his regular day off, but in casual clothes that would allow him to move through the world unrecognized. He had research to do, and he couldn't risk being identified. First stop, the public records office across town. If Rains and Carter had documentation on the Morelli case, he needed to know exactly what they had access to. 2 hours later, Nathan sat in a small research room, surrounded by file boxes. The complete court record of Morelli versus Westlake County spread before him, along with public records of Morelli's bankruptcy filing, tax liens, and eventual financial recovery. Judge Holloway? Nathan startled, looking up to find Sarah Winters, his longtime court clerk, standing in the doorway. Her expression shifted from surprise to confusion as she took in the stacks of documents surrounding him. Sarah, he said, recovering quickly. What brings you here? Filing for the Diaz case, she replied, her curious gaze still fixed on the Morelli documents. But the more interesting question is what brings you here on your day off, researching a case from 7 years ago. Nathan hesitated. Sarah had been his clerk for nearly a decade. If there was anyone in the courthouse he trusted, it was her. But involving her could put her career at risk if things went sideways. "Close the door," he said finally. 20 minutes later, Sarah sat across from him, her face pale with shock. "Blackmail," she whispered. "Rains and Carter are planning to blackmail you. That's career-ending for them, if I can prove it," Nathan finished. "But first, I need to understand exactly what happened with Morelli after the appeal. The official record shows the ruling was overturned, damages were paid, and his reputation was restored. But something in their conversation suggested the story didn't end there. They seemed convinced this would ruin me, which means either they don't have the full record, or there's something missing from it," Sarah concluded. "Exactly. I need to find James Morelli." Sarah pulled out her phone. "I can start with the basics. Last known address, current employment, social media." "No," Nathan interrupted. "No electronic trail that could be traced back to the courthouse. We do this old school." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. "I'll check property records and business licenses this afternoon." "Where will you be?" "Continuing my janitorial duties," Nathan said grimly. "I need to keep an eye on Rains and Carter without arousing suspicion." 4 hours later, Nathan pushed his cleaning cart past courtroom 3B, where Philip Rains was concluding arguments in a minor contract dispute. From his vantage point in the hallway, Nathan observed the attorney's confident stance, the easy charm he directed toward the jury. Rains was good, one of the best performers in the courthouse. Nathan's phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from Sarah. "Found him. Morelli's Beach House. Coastal Highway, mile marker 37. Opened 3 years ago. A restaurant." Morelli had rebuilt his business after all. That was a promising sign. Nathan continued his maintenance routine, making his way methodically toward the administrative offices. As he emptied a trash can outside the records room, he spotted Melissa Carter emerging from the clerk's office, a large accordion file tucked under her arm. She walked briskly, heels clicking against marble, not sparing a glance for the janitor bent over his work. Nathan angled his body away, but not before glimpsing the label on the file. "Judge N. Holloway, Case Histories, 2015 to 2020. His stomach clenched. They were compiling a dossier on him, searching for additional pressure points beyond the Morelli case. Nathan waited until Carter disappeared around the corner before straightening. He needed to move fast. By 6 p.m., Nathan had changed into civilian clothes and was driving his nondescript sedan toward the coast. The restaurant was an hour away, close enough to visit, but far enough that Morelli had clearly relocated after his original business failed. The beach house turned out to be a charming seafood restaurant perched on stilts overlooking the water. A weathered sign featuring a blue crab welcomed visitors, while string lights created a warm glow around the outdoor deck. The parking lot was nearly full, a good sign for a Friday evening. Nathan approached the hostess stand, his heart inexplicably racing. "Table for one, please." "Of course, sir," the young woman replied, grabbing a menu. "Inside or deck?" "Inside, if possible." "And?" Nathan hesitated. "Is Mr. Morelli in this evening?" "James Morelli?" The hostess's expression turned guarded. "May I ask what this is regarding?" "An old case," Nathan said truthfully. "I'd like to speak with him about its resolution." "Your name, sir?" "Nathan," he replied, deliberately omitting his last name. "Just tell him it's about Westlake County." The hostess nodded and led him to a corner table with a view of both the water and the kitchen entrance. "I'll let him know you're here." Nathan ordered a drink to settle his nerves, studying the menu without really seeing it. 15 minutes passed before a shadow fell across his table. "You've got a lot of nerve coming here." Nathan looked up to find James Morelli standing before him, older than in his court photos, with more gray at his temples and deeper lines around his eyes, but unmistakably the same man. "Mr. Morelli," Nathan began. "Thank you for..." "Save it," Morelli cut him off. I recognized you the moment you walked in, Judge Holloway. What I don't understand is why you're here. The case is over. You won. The system won. What more do you want? Nathan blinked in confusion. I was under the impression that the appeal. The appeal? Morelli laughed bitterly. You mean that piece of theater where the court admitted a regrettable error had occurred, awarded me pennies on the dollar for what I lost, and everyone patted themselves on the back for fixing the problem? Nathan felt the ground shifting beneath his carefully constructed understanding of the case. The record shows you were compensated fairly. That your business. My business was destroyed, Morelli said flatly. 3 generations of goodwill in the community gone. My family's legacy erased. The money covered my debts barely. This, he gestured around the restaurant. I built from nothing, in a new town where nobody knew me as the man who lost everything in suspicious circumstances. I didn't know, Nathan said quietly. Of course you didn't. You signed the appeal ruling, expressed appropriate judicial regret, and moved on to the next case. Meanwhile, I spent 3 years rebuilding my life from scratch. Morelli leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. So I'll ask again, why are you here, Judge Holloway? To ease your conscience? Looking for forgiveness? Or is someone finally holding you accountable for what happened? The last question sent a chill through Nathan. It was too specific, too pointed. Mr. Morelli, he said carefully, has someone contacted you recently about my ruling in your case? Something flickered across Morelli's face, surprise followed quickly by wariness. Why don't you tell me why you're really here? Morelli said, pulling out the chair across from Nathan and sitting down. And this time, I want the truth. 2 attorneys came to see me last month, Morelli said, folding his hands on the table. Well-dressed. Polished. The kind that charge more per hour than most people make in a week. Nathan's pulse quickened. Raines and Carter? Morelli nodded slowly. They said they were investigating judicial misconduct. Claimed they were representing clients who had suffered similar miscarriages of justice. And you believed them? Why shouldn't I? Morelli's eyes narrowed. Your ruling cost me everything I had. The appeal was too little, too late. The compensation barely covered my debts, not what I lost in potential earnings or my family's legacy. Nathan absorbed this, mentally comparing it with the official record. The appeal had awarded Morelli $1.2 million in damages, substantial by any measure, but perhaps inadequate for a business that had been in operation for 3 generations. What exactly did they want from you? Nathan asked. My story? Documentation. Photographs of the original restaurant before demolition. Statements from former employees who lost their jobs. Morelli gestured to a waiter passing by. Jake over there? His father worked for me at the original place. Lost his health insurance when we closed. Died 6 months later from a heart condition that went untreated. The waiter nodded respectfully toward them before continuing to his table. Nathan felt a weight settling in his chest. Did they mention what they planned to do with this information? They said something about a pattern of judicial oversight failures. Class action potential. Morelli studied Nathan's face. But that's not really why they're collecting dirt on you, is it? Nathan hesitated, then decided that honesty was his only viable strategy. They planned to blackmail me into influencing a ruling in an upcoming case. Morelli let out a low whistle. And now you're here to, what? Ask me not to cooperate with them? No, Nathan said firmly. I'm here to understand what really happened. The complete story, not just what made it into the official record. For the next hour, Nathan listened as Morelli detailed the aftermath of his ruling. The hasty appeal had overturned the decision, but by then, the damage had been done. Contractors had already begun demolition. Suppliers had cancelled contracts. Longtime customers had found new establishments. The compensation had covered immediate financial losses but couldn't restore what had been lost: reputation, generational goodwill, family legacy. It took me 3 years to get back on my feet, Morelli concluded. 3 years of starting over in a new town where nobody knew me as the restaurant owner who lost everything under suspicious circumstances. Those rumors about financial impropriety, where did they come from? Nathan asked. The county's PR team, Morelli said bitterly. They needed to justify the rapid demolition, so they implied there were health code violations, tax issues, structural problems. All lies, but mud sticks, especially in a small community. Nathan made detailed notes, a strategy forming in his mind. Mr. Morelli, would you be willing to put this on record? The full story, including what happened after the appeal. Morelli leaned back, studying him. Why should I help you? Because I made a mistake that hurt you, Nathan said simply. And now I want to make it right, not just for my sake, but because the same attorneys who are using your pain as leverage are representing a corporation that has hurt many others. Something in Morelli's expression shifted. The appeal judge, that was you too, wasn't it? You expedited the process. Nathan nodded. Once I discovered the error, I pushed to correct it immediately. But I never followed up to see if the remedy was adequate. That was my second mistake. Morelli considered this, then slowly nodded. I'll think about it. Give me your number. If I decide to help, I'll call you. Nathan left the restaurant with mixed emotions. The conversation with Morelli had revealed gaps in the official narrative, gaps that Rains and Carter were undoubtedly planning to exploit. But it had also given him insight into their strategy. Driving back to the city, Nathan called Sarah. I need everything we have on the Caliber Enterprises case, he said without preamble. Not just the filings and evidence, I want to know about the victims. The class action plaintiffs? Sarah asked. Yes. How many are there? What did they lose? Are there parallels to Morelli's situation? I'll have it for you tomorrow morning, Sarah promised. What happened with Morelli? It's complicated, Nathan replied. The official record was sanitized. The appeal and compensation looked good on paper, but the reality was messier. Rains and Carter have been collecting his story, documentation, probably statements from others affected by the closure. That's bad, Sarah said. It is, Nathan agreed. But it also tells us something about their strategy. They're building a narrative, not just about a legal error, but about a pattern of callousness toward those affected by judicial decisions. So what's our next move? I continue my janitorial duties, Nathan said. I need to know if they've approached anyone else from my past cases. Meanwhile, I need you to quietly pull records of every major decision I've made in the past decade. That's hundreds of cases, Sarah protested. Focus on the ones where my rulings had significant financial implications for individuals or small businesses, Nathan directed. Cases where there might be a personal story they could exploit. After ending the call, Nathan drove to a small apartment across town, the temporary residence he'd rented under his alias for the duration of his undercover operation. It was Spartan but functional, with a small desk that was now covered with notes and documentation. He spent the rest of the evening reviewing the Caliber Enterprises case files. The corporation stood accused of defrauding investors through misleading financial statements, resulting in millions of dollars in losses when the truth emerged. Over 300 plaintiffs had joined the class action, many of them retirees who had lost significant portions of their savings. If he ruled in favor of the corporation, as Rains and Carter wanted, those people would receive nothing. Nathan rubbed his tired eyes. The parallels to Morelli's situation were obvious. Ordinary people suffering while those responsible faced minimal consequences. Was that the pattern of his career? Cold adherence to the law without regard for human impact? A notification pinged on his secure laptop. Sarah had uploaded a preliminary list of cases matching his criteria. 27 rulings over 10 years where individuals had suffered significant financial losses following his decisions. Nathan's heart sank as he scanned the list. Any one of these could be another Morelli, another story for Rains and Carter to weaponize. His phone rang, displaying an unknown number. Hello? Judge Holloway. James Morelli's voice. I've been thinking about our conversation. Nathan held his breath. Those attorneys, Morelli continued. They came back last week, asking more specific questions, wanting me to sign an affidavit about how your ruling destroyed my life. Did you sign it? Not yet. They're coming back tomorrow for my decision. A pause. Before I decide, I need to know something. This case they're working on, what's at stake? Nathan chose his words carefully. 300 families who lost their retirement savings to corporate fraud. If I rule as Rains and Carter want, those families get nothing. The corporation keeps the money and moves on. Silence stretched across the line. I'll help you, Morelli said finally. Not for you, for those families. No one should have to rebuild from ashes like I did. Thank you, Nathan said, relief flooding through him. What did you have in mind? Those attorneys want a story of judicial indifference. Let's give them one they won't forget. There was a new edge to Morelli's voice. I'll sign their affidavit. With a few modifications they won't notice until it's too late. As Morelli outlined his idea, Nathan felt the first stirrings of hope. This wasn't just about saving his reputation anymore. It was about justice for Morelli, for the Caliber plaintiffs, and for a system that needed to be protected from manipulation. The battle of wits had begun, and Judge Nathan Holloway was determined not to fight alone. Saturday morning found Nathan in the courthouse archives, his janitor's uniform exchanged for casual weekend attire. The building was mostly empty, with only a few dedicated staff catching up on paperwork. Sarah had used her credentials to grant him after-hours access, claiming a special judicial review project. The Morelli case files sat before him, alongside a stack of documents Sarah had quietly assembled, internal court communications, notes from the appeals process, and the complete compensation package details. Somewhere in this mountain of paperwork lay the truth that Rains and Carter were twisting. I brought coffee, Sarah announced, entering the small conference room with 2 steaming cups. Any breakthroughs? Nathan rubbed his eyes. Maybe. The appeal record shows Morelli received $1.2 million in damages. His statement to me suggests it barely covered his debts. I need to understand that discrepancy. Tax implications? Sarah suggested, sliding a folder toward him. The settlement would have been taxable income. Nathan flipped through the documents, skimming quickly. Good thought, but that's not it. The court recognized the tax burden and adjusted the amount accordingly. He paused, finger hovering over a paragraph. Wait. This is interesting. Sarah leaned over his shoulder. What? The settlement included a confidentiality clause. The county insisted on it, standard procedure to prevent copycat lawsuits. Nathan's brow furrowed. But look at this rider. Party agrees to refrain from any public statements implying judicial misconduct or deliberate error. They muzzled him, Sarah said, understanding immediately. Which means, Nathan continued, that if Morelli signed an affidavit for Rains and Carter alleging my negligence caused his losses, he'd be violating the settlement terms, and potentially required to return the money. Nathan sat back, connecting the dots. That's why Morelli was so bitter when I met him. He got the money, but lost his voice, his ability to tell the truth about what happened. Sarah's expression darkened. That's not justice. No, Nathan agreed. It's damage control. But here's what I don't understand. Rains and Carter are experienced attorneys. They must know about the confidentiality clause. Why ask Morelli to sign an affidavit that would put him in legal jeopardy? Sarah considered this. Maybe they don't intend to actually use it? Just having it might be enough to pressure you. Or maybe. Nathan shuffled through the papers, searching for something. Here. The settlement agreement itself. Look at the signatory line. Sarah squinted at the document. It's signed by Judge William Crawford on behalf of the court. Crawford, Nathan repeated. Who handles most of the corporate litigation in this courthouse. Who would be the likely alternate if I were to recuse myself from the Caliber case? The implications hung in the air between them. You think Judge Crawford was involved in silencing Morelli? Sarah asked quietly. I think it's worth investigating who pushed for that specific confidentiality clause, Nathan replied, and whether Crawford has any connections to Caliber Enterprises. The research took on new urgency. While Sarah dug into Judge Crawford's case history, Nathan focused on comparing the official Morelli case records with the narrative Rains and Carter were constructing. By mid-afternoon, a clearer picture emerged. The blackmail documents contained carefully selected excerpts from court records, Morelli's initial impact statements, and county assessment reports, all technically accurate but stripped of critical context. They've created a misleading narrative, Nathan explained, spreading the documents across the table for Sarah to see. They include my erroneous ruling and its immediate consequences but omit the appeal outcome entirely. They highlight Morelli's financial losses but exclude the compensation details. Half-truths, Sarah observed. Exactly. And look here. Nathan pointed to a timeline Rains and Carter had constructed. They imply 8 months passed before anyone noticed the error, suggesting negligence or cover-up. But the court records show the error was identified during a routine audit, immediately reported, and the appeal process expedited. So they're lying. Not technically. They're just strategically silent on key facts. Nathan traced the manipulated timeline with his finger. But there's something even more interesting. The documents they've compiled, they don't include anything that wouldn't be in the public record. Sarah caught on immediately. Meaning they don't have inside information. They're working from publicly available documents. Which gives us an advantage, Nathan said, the first genuine smile in days crossing his face. They don't know what's in the internal court communications or the sealed portions of the appeal. His phone buzzed with an incoming text from Morelli. Meeting with lawyers at 3 p.m. We'll call after. Nathan checked his watch. 2:45. His heart rate kicked up a notch. There's something else, Sarah said, holding up a printout. Judge Crawford has ruled on 3 separate cases involving Caliber subsidiaries in the past 5 years. All rulings favored the corporation. That could be coincidence, Nathan cautioned. Corporate law is complex. True, but in 2 of those cases, the attorneys representing Caliber were Rains and Carter. Nathan finished, already anticipating her answer. Yes. And there's more. Sarah hesitated. I found a disclosure statement buried in Crawford's financial filings from 3 years ago. He owns stock in Westlake Financial Partners. Why is that significant? Because Westlake Financial Partners is a major investor in Caliber Enterprises. The pieces were falling into place with dizzying speed. Nathan's mind raced through the implications. They never intended to leak the Morelli story to the media, he realized. That was just a threat. What they really want is for me to recuse myself so Crawford gets the case. And rules in Caliber's favor, Sarah finished. Protecting his own investment in the process. But they need me to recuse myself for a reason that wouldn't raise suspicions about Crawford. Sarah snapped her fingers. Like a potential conflict of interest due to your history with the Morelli case. If they can establish a pattern of your rulings harming small businesses or individuals, then my impartiality in the Caliber case could be questioned, Nathan concluded. Clever. Very clever. His phone rang. Morelli. They're gone, Morelli said without preamble. I signed their affidavit, but with the modifications we discussed. Made a big show of my bitterness, told them how you never followed up personally after the appeal. How did they react? Like sharks smelling blood. They didn't even notice the small changes to the wording. Morelli paused. There's something else. When they thought I wasn't listening, I overheard them mentioning something about Crawford taking over the case. You're sure they said Crawford? Nathan asked, though he already knew the answer. Positive. Something about him being more amenable to their position. Thank you, James. This is extremely helpful. After ending the call, Nathan turned to Sarah, determination hardening his features. We need to move quickly. Monday morning, Rains and Carter will request a private meeting before the Caliber hearing. They'll present their manipulated evidence, threaten to make it public, and suggest I recuse myself to avoid scandal. And if you refuse? They'll file a formal motion questioning my impartiality, citing the Morelli case as evidence of bias against corporate interests. Sarah nodded, understanding the strategy. So what's our countermove? Nathan gathered the documents, a plan crystallizing in his mind. We prepare the complete record, not just what's public but the internal communications and appeal details. We demonstrate how they've manipulated the timeline and omitted critical facts. He paused, considering his next move carefully. And we investigate Crawford's financial ties to Caliber Enterprises. That won't be easy, Sarah cautioned. Those records are carefully protected. Then it's fortunate I have an alternate identity with access to places most people overlook. Nathan reached for his janitor's uniform, folded neatly in his bag. Judge Holloway may not be able to access Crawford's office without raising eyebrows. But Nate the janitor can, Sarah finished, a smile breaking across her face. Tonight, Nathan confirmed. While Nate cleans the judicial offices, he might accidentally discover some relevant documents. The truth was emerging, piece by manipulated piece, and Nathan felt a newfound resolve. This was no longer just about protecting his reputation. It was about exposing a corruption that threatened the very foundation of justice in his courthouse. Sunday night blurred into Monday morning as Nathan finalized his preparations. His apartment looked like a war room, documents spread across every surface, timelines taped to walls, and a whiteboard covered with interconnected notes. He had slept barely 3 hours, but adrenaline kept him sharp. Run through it one more time, Sarah said, handing him a fresh cup of coffee. She had arrived at 6 a.m., dark circles under her eyes betraying her own sleepless night. Nathan nodded, mentally rehearsing the confrontation to come. Raines and Carter requested a meeting at 8:30, 30 minutes before the Caliber hearing. They'll present their doctored evidence about the Morelli case, suggest I have a pattern of bias against business interests, and recommend I recuse myself to avoid scandal. And then? A thin smile crossed his face. Then I spring the trap. The documents he'd gathered from Judge Crawford's office had exceeded his expectations. Not only had he found additional evidence of Crawford's financial interest in Caliber subsidiaries, but also emails between Crawford and Philip Raines discussing judicial reassignment of the Caliber case. Nothing explicitly illegal. They were too careful for that, but the timing and context spoke volumes. Most damning of all was a draft motion, already prepared, challenging Nathan's impartiality and requesting Crawford as an alternate judge. The document was dated 3 weeks ago, long before Raines and Carter approached Morelli or began compiling their blackmail materials. This wasn't opportunistic, Nathan had realized. They planned this from the beginning. Now, as he straightened his judicial robes and gathered the files for his countermove, Nathan felt a strange calm settle over him. For 15 years, he had wielded his authority from the bench, seen through witness lies and attorney theatrics. Today, he would use those same skills in a different kind of courtroom drama. Ready? Sarah asked, holding the door. One last thing, Nathan said, pulling out his phone. A text to Marvin. Thank you for everything. Your new hire has completed his assignment. Then, to James Morelli. It's happening this morning. Whatever they say afterward, know that you helped make it right. The courthouse was already busy when they arrived, attorneys and clients filling the corridors with purposeful energy. Nathan took a back entrance to avoid early encounters with Raines and Carter, making his way to his chambers through service corridors that had become familiar during his weeks as a janitor. Sarah arranged the documents on his desk according to their plan, the manipulated Morelli materials in one folder, the complete record in another, and the Crawford evidence in a third. A digital recorder sat discreetly beside his legal pad. At precisely 8:25, his intercom buzzed. Judge Holloway? Attorneys Raines and Carter are here for your 8:30. Nathan took a deep breath. Send them in. They entered with practiced confidence. Philip Raines in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, Melissa Carter in a steel gray dress that conveyed both authority and restraint. Both carried leather portfolios embossed with their firm's logo. Judge Holloway, Raines began, his voice warm with false collegiality. "Thank you for making time before this morning's hearing." "Of course," Nathan replied evenly. "I understand you have a matter of some urgency to discuss." "Indeed." Carter placed her portfolio on the desk, expertly aligning its edges with the surface. "It concerns a rather delicate issue that we felt should be addressed privately, out of respect for your distinguished career." Nathan gestured for them to continue, his expression betraying nothing. Rains took the lead, opening his portfolio with theatrical gravity. "In preparing for the Caliber Enterprises case, we conducted routine background research on precedents and judicial history." He paused, affecting reluctance. "During this process, we uncovered some concerning information regarding a previous case over which you presided. The Morelli case," Nathan supplied, watching their momentary surprise at his directness. "Yes," Carter confirmed, recovering quickly. "James Morelli vs. Westlake County, 2018. A property dispute with significant consequences." "Catastrophic consequences," Rains corrected, sliding a document across the desk. "As these records show, your ruling in that case resulted in Mr. Morelli losing his business, his family home, and his standing in the community." Nathan glanced at the document, the same selectively edited timeline he'd already studied. "I see. We believe," Carter continued, "that this history raises questions about potential bias in cases involving business interests, particularly where individual livelihoods are at stake. Such as the Caliber Enterprises matter," Nathan observed. "Precisely," Rains agreed, clearly pleased by Nathan's apparent understanding. "Given these circumstances, we wanted to offer you an opportunity to address this potential conflict of interest." "By recusing myself," Nathan finished for him. "It would be the prudent course," Carter said softly. "Otherwise, we would be obligated to file a formal motion challenging your impartiality, which could become public." The threat hung in the air, delivered with just enough professional veneer to maintain plausible deniability. Nathan steepled his fingers, regarding them silently for a long moment. Both attorneys maintained eye contact, their expressions a careful blend of concern and determination. "I appreciate your discretion," Nathan said finally. "These are serious allegations that warrant careful consideration." Relief flickered across their faces. They believed he was capitulating. "However," Nathan continued, reaching for the second folder, "I find myself troubled by certain omissions in your narrative." He opened the folder, revealing the complete Morelli case record. "You've presented a version of events that excludes critical facts, the appeal process I personally expedited, the substantial compensation awarded, and Mr. Morelli's current successful restaurant business on the coast." Rains shifted uncomfortably. "The initial harm was addressed through proper legal channels," Nathan interrupted. "Furthermore, I have here Mr. Morelli's amended affidavit, clarifying that while the error had serious consequences, the appeals process ultimately delivered appropriate redress." Carter's eyes narrowed. "Amended?" "Yes. The version he provided you on Saturday contained several modifications to your original text. Small changes that transformed the document from an accusation of judicial misconduct to a factual account of a procedural error that was subsequently corrected." Nathan smiled thinly. "Mr. Morelli was quite cooperative once he understood the full context of your interest in his case." Rains and Carter exchanged glances, their confidence visibly eroding. "But perhaps most concerning," Nathan continued, opening the third folder, "is this draft motion challenging my impartiality, prepared 3 weeks ago, before you had even begun collecting information on the Morelli case." The color drained from Rains's face. "And these emails between you, Mr. Rains, and Judge Crawford, discussing the reassignment of the Caliber case to his courtroom." Nathan placed the printouts on the desk. "Alongside documentation of Judge Crawford's financial interest in Caliber subsidiaries through his investment in Westlake Financial Partners." Nathan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "So let me offer an alternative narrative. You never intended to publicly expose the Morelli case. That was merely leverage to force my recusal, allowing Judge Crawford, with whom you have a suspiciously favorable history and who has a financial interest in Caliber's success, to take over the case." Complete silence filled the chamber. Carter sat perfectly still, her legal mind undoubtedly calculating options and outcomes. Raines looked physically ill, sweat beading on his forehead. "What do you want?" Carter asked finally, her voice professional but strained. Nathan closed the folders deliberately. "Justice." "What exactly are you proposing, Judge Holloway?" Melissa Carter's voice had regained its professional edge, though her knuckles remained white as she gripped the armrest. Nathan studied them both before answering. Philip Raines had visibly deflated, his earlier confidence replaced by the haunted look of a man watching his career disintegrate. Carter, however, remained composed, calculating even in crisis. "I'm proposing we address this ethically and legally," Nathan replied. "You have two options." He opened a drawer and removed a prepared document. "Option 1. You both withdraw immediately from representing Caliber Enterprises, citing an unexpected conflict of interest. You provide a signed statement acknowledging your attempt to manipulate judicial assignments, with the understanding that this statement remains sealed unless you engage in similar conduct in the future." "And option 2? Carter asked, already knowing the answer. "I submit this evidence to the Bar Association's Ethics Committee, the Chief Judge, and if warranted, the District Attorney's Office." Nathan's tone was matter-of-fact. "Your attempted manipulation of the judicial system warrants scrutiny by all three." Silence stretched between them. The ticking of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud. "We need to confer," Carter said finally. "Of course." Nathan gestured toward the small conference area in the corner of his chambers. "You have 5 minutes. The Caliber hearing begins at 9. As they huddled in urgent whispers, Nathan caught fragments of their conversation. Career-ending and disbarment featured prominently. He felt no satisfaction in their distress, only a solemn recognition that actions carried consequences. Sarah slipped into the room, raising an eyebrow in silent question. Nathan gave her a slight nod, confirming that everything was proceeding as planned. She placed the document on his desk, the amended hearing schedule, before departing with the same discretion. 4 minutes later, Carter approached his desk, Raines trailing behind like a shadow. "We'll withdraw from the case," she stated, professional composure intact despite the circumstances. "And sign your statement." Nathan pushed the document toward them. "Both signatures, please." As they signed, Nathan studied their faces. Carter's expression revealed nothing beyond grim acceptance. Raines, however, couldn't conceal his resentment, a dangerous emotion that Nathan made note of. "The hearing will proceed as scheduled," Nathan informed them, taking the signed statement. "Caliber Enterprises has been notified that you've withdrawn. They've requested a 2-day continuance to secure new counsel, which I've granted. You've been planning this all along." Raines muttered, the first words he'd spoken since their scheme unraveled. "Since the moment I overheard your conversation in the attorney's break room," Nathan confirmed. Confusion flickered across their faces. "You were there?" Carter asked. "How did you?" Understanding dawned in her eyes. "The janitor," she whispered. "That was you." Nathan merely smiled. Attorneys often overlook those they consider invisible. A dangerous oversight. Their departure from his chambers lacked the confident stride with which they'd entered. Through his window, Nathan watched them cross the courthouse plaza, already on their phones. Damage control, no doubt. At precisely 9:30, Sarah entered with an update. "Raines and Carter have left the building. Judge Crawford called in sick." "Not surprising," Nathan remarked. "He likely received a warning call. The clerk's office has already reassigned his cases." Sarah placed another folder on his desk. "And Chief Judge Barnes wants to see you this afternoon." "Also not surprising," Nathan said with a sigh. "My methods were unorthodox. But effective," Sarah pointed out. "Perhaps. But there will be questions about my undercover operation, accessing Crawford's office, the investigation of fellow attorneys." Nathan shook his head. "I broke several protocols, even if for the right reasons." Sarah's expression softened. Would you do it differently, knowing what you know now? Nathan considered this. No, he finally answered. Some things matter more than protocols. The Caliber Enterprises hearing resumed 2 days later with new defense counsel, a team from a different firm with no apparent connections to Judge Crawford. Nathan presided with his usual thoroughness, evaluating arguments purely on their legal merits. When he delivered his ruling, it reflected the complex reality of the case. Partial liability for Caliber in 3 areas where evidence clearly established wrongdoing, dismissal of 2 charges where evidence was insufficient, and a compensation structure that prioritized restoring actual losses to the affected investors. Neither side received everything they wanted, a hallmark of thoughtful jurisprudence. As the courtroom cleared, Nathan noticed James Morelli sitting in the back row. With a subtle nod, Morelli acknowledged him before slipping out. That afternoon, Nathan found himself in Chief Judge Eleanor Barnes's office, facing questions about his unorthodox investigation. You placed yourself in an extremely vulnerable position, she noted, reviewing his detailed report. Not to mention the potential ethical concerns about surveilling court personnel. I understand, Nathan acknowledged. But once I discovered the plot, traditional channels seemed insufficient. Barnes studied him for a long moment. Crawford has submitted his resignation, citing health concerns. That's convenient, Nathan observed. Indeed. Her tone made it clear she understood the real reason. The Bar Association has opened a formal investigation into Raines and Carter. They've requested your evidence and testimony. They'll have my full cooperation. Barnes leaned back in her chair. You know, in 30 years on the bench, I've never heard of a judge going undercover as a janitor. Desperate circumstances, Nathan said with a slight smile. Perhaps. She closed the file. But I wonder if there's more to it. What did you learn, Nathan? Beyond uncovering this particular scheme? The question caught him off guard. He considered it carefully before answering. I learned that justice doesn't just happen in courtrooms, he said slowly. It happens, or fails to happen, in break rooms, in private conversations, in the moments when people think no one is watching. He paused. I learned that following procedure isn't always the same as delivering justice. And Morelli? Barnes asked. What happens with him? I've petitioned to have the confidentiality clause in his settlement reviewed, Nathan replied. No one should have to choose between compensation and truth. Barnes nodded approvingly. And what about Nathan Holloway? What happens with him? It was a deeper question than it appeared, one about his future, his approach to justice, his understanding of his role. He remembers what it's like to be invisible, Nathan said after a thoughtful pause, and ensures that no one in his courtroom feels that way again. 1 month later, Nathan stepped out of his car at the marina, breathing in the salt air. The beach house restaurant glowed with warmth against the darkening sky, string lights creating a welcoming path to its entrance. Inside, James Morelli greeted him with a firm handshake. Judge Holloway. Or should I call you Nate? Nathan is fine, he replied with a smile. Thank you for inviting me. Least I could do. Your petition worked. The confidentiality clause has been struck from my settlement. I can finally tell my full story. Morelli led him to a table overlooking the water. Though it's a different story now than it would have been before. How so? Before, it was about failure, the system failing, justice failing. Morelli shrugged. Now it's more complicated. Systems fail, but people within them can still fight to make things right. Nathan nodded thoughtfully. A more nuanced perspective. The world is full of nuance, Morelli agreed. Something tells me you see that more clearly now, too. As they shared a meal and conversation flowed, Nathan reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From respected judge to undercover janitor to someone caught in the middle of a blackmail scheme, each role had shown him different facets of the justice system he'd devoted his life to. The headlines about Crawford's resignation and the Bar Association's investigation of Raines and Carter had faded from the news cycle. The Caliber plaintiffs had begun receiving their compensation. The system had corrected itself, as systems sometimes do. But Nathan knew that vigilance was the price of justice. Sometimes that meant following procedure and precedent. Sometimes it meant grabbing a mop and seeing what happened when no one thought the judge was watching. As he raised a glass to toast with Morelli, Nathan smiled at the thought that somewhere in the courthouse, a janitor was noticing things that others missed, witnessing the true mechanics of justice in motion. After all, the most important judgments often happened outside the courtroom.